Have you noticed something strange? The people who try the hardest to make everyone happy often end up the most emotionally exhausted. And maybe that person is you. Maybe you are the one who always says, "It's okay, don't worry about me, I'll handle it," even when you are falling apart inside. You answer messages immediately because you are afraid someone might feel ignored. You apologize too quickly. You overthink tiny changes in people's tone. You carry everyone's stress like it is your responsibility to keep the world peaceful. And after years of doing this, something inside you changes. You become tired all the time, not physically, spiritually, emotionally. You smile in conversations while secretly feeling empty. You help everyone else while quietly wishing somebody would finally notice your pain too. But here is the dangerous part. Most people never realize they are slowly losing themselves. They think this is kindness. They think this is love. They think this is what good people do. So they spend decades sacrificing their peace just to avoid disappointing others. Until one day they wake up and realize something terrifying. Nobody actually knows who they really are, because they spent their entire life becoming whoever made other people comfortable. And if you keep living this way, it follows you into old age, into marriage, into family, into every relationship you have. You become the person everyone depends on, while secretly feeling completely alone. But what happens when a person finally stops? What happens when you stop apologizing for existing? What happens when you stop sacrificing yourself for approval? At first, it feels terrifying. But what happens next may completely transform your life. And before this video ends, you may realize the thing destroying your happiness was never other people. It was the habit of abandoning yourself every single day just to keep them comfortable. There are people who go through almost their whole life without ever realizing how much of themselves they've given away. Not in some dramatic movie kind of way. It happens quietly, a little here, a little there, one swallowed opinion, one forced smile, one more "it's okay," when it really wasn't okay at all. And after enough years, it becomes automatic. You stop noticing it. You stop noticing how often you stay quiet just to keep the mood peaceful, how quickly you say sorry, how naturally you put everybody else first without even thinking about it anymore. Maybe that sounds familiar. Maybe you've been doing it so long that it feels like personality now. Not a habit, not a coping mechanism, just who you are. The easygoing one, the reliable one, the person who never wants to make things difficult for anybody. You know the type. Maybe you are that person at family dinners, the one nodding along even when you disagree. The one helping clean the kitchen while everyone else relaxes in the living room. The one hearing, "You're such a good son," or "You've always been the responsible one," and somehow feeling proud and tired at the same time. Because that's the strange thing nobody talks about. Sometimes people praise you for the very thing that's quietly exhausting you. And maybe it started years ago. You were the child who didn't want to disappoint anybody. Maybe your parents worked hard. Maybe they sacrificed a lot. Maybe you could see stress in their faces before you were even old enough to understand adult problems. So you learned to become easy. Easy to manage, easy to rely on, easy to expect things from. You learned how to read the room before speaking. You learned when to stay quiet. You learned how to ignore what you wanted if it made someone else uncomfortable. And the scary part is, people reward that behavior. Teachers like you. Relatives praise you. People call you mature. Meanwhile, little by little, you lose touch with your own voice. Not all at once. Slowly. So slowly, you barely notice it happening. Maybe there was something you wanted once, a different career, a different life, a city you wanted to move to, a relationship you knew wasn't right, but stayed in anyway because leaving would disappoint too many people. And now sometimes you sit quietly and wonder what your life would have looked like if you had chosen yourself just once. Not in a selfish way, just honestly. That thought hits harder as people get older, especially at night. especially after 50. There's something painful about realizing you spent decades trying to become someone everybody approved of, while barely knowing yourself anymore. And relationships make this even more complicated. Some people listening right now have spent years loving people who only felt safe as long as they kept sacrificing themselves. You know what I mean. Always being understanding, always forgiving, always adjusting. You tell yourself, they're just stressed. They didn't mean it. It's not worth fighting over. So you let things slide, again and again and again, until one day you realize you've become an expert at tolerating things that quietly break your heart. Some people stay in relationships where they can't even speak honestly anymore. They rehearse conversations in their head before bringing something up. They carefully choose words so the other person won't get upset. They apologize halfway through expressing pain. Imagine living like that for 10 years, 20 years. Some people do it for a lifetime. And from the outside, nobody notices. That's the lonely part. People see the anniversary photos, the family gatherings, the smiling pictures online. They don't see the exhaustion afterward, the silence in the car ride home, the nights lying awake replaying conversations. They don't see how emotionally tired a person becomes when they spend years walking on eggshells inside their own relationships. And then there's work. Honestly, work drains a lot of people like this. The dependable employee, the person everyone asks for help, the coworker who never says no. Maybe your boss loves you because you always stay late. Maybe coworkers dump extra tasks on you because they know you'll handle it without complaining. At first, it feels good to be needed. It makes you feel valuable. But after a while, something changes. You start noticing how resentful you feel driving home, how exhausted you feel before the day even starts. You answer emails while eating dinner. You think about work while trying to sleep. You feel guilty resting. And still, when someone asks for another favor, you hear yourself saying, "Sure, no problem, I got it," even though every part of you wants to say, "I can't keep doing this." But saying no feels dangerous. Because people who spend years earning love through usefulness eventually become terrified of disappointing others. So they overextend themselves, overexplain themselves, overgive, and somehow still feel guilty. There's also another kind of loneliness people don't talk about enough, the loneliness of being the strong friend, the listener, the peacemaker, the one everybody vents to. You remember birthdays, you check on people, you notice when someone's mood changes, but very few people notice yours. And maybe you've gotten so good at hiding your pain that nobody even thinks to ask anymore. You laugh when you're tired. You smile when you're hurt. You say, "I'm fine," automatically, sometimes so automatically that even you stop questioning it. Then one night, usually when the house is finally quiet, something catches up to you. Maybe it happens while washing dishes, maybe while sitting in the car after a family gathering, maybe after a phone call where someone talked about themselves for an hour and never once asked how you were doing. And suddenly there's this overwhelming feeling, not anger exactly, not sadness exactly, just exhaustion, deep exhaustion, the kind that sleep doesn't fix. Because it's not your body that's tired. It's the constant emotional performance, the constant adjusting, constant pleasing, constant monitoring of everybody else's comfort. Human beings aren't built to live disconnected from themselves forever. At some point, the soul starts pushing back. Quietly at first. You notice yourself feeling irritated more often, numb sometimes, emotionally distant. You start fantasizing about disappearing for a while, turning your phone off, being somewhere nobody needs anything from you. And then comes the really painful realization. A lot of your relationships only work because you keep abandoning yourself to maintain them. That realization changes people. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it anymore. You start noticing how often you shrink yourself, how often you say yes out of guilt, how often you smile just to make others comfortable. And eventually, a question begins showing up in your mind over and over again. What would happen if I stopped? Not stopped loving people, not stopped caring, just stopped disappearing. Stopped apologizing for having needs. Stopped making yourself emotionally small so everyone else can feel comfortable around you. That question scares people, especially people who've spent their whole life being good, because somewhere deep down, there's still that old fear. If I stop pleasing everyone, will people still love me? And honestly, that fear runs deep, deeper than most people realize. But there's another truth, too. A person can spend so many years trying not to disappoint others that eventually they completely abandon themselves. That's the real tragedy. Not rejection, not conflict. Losing yourself so gradually you don't even notice it until one day you wake up emotionally exhausted, staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m, wondering why your life feels so heavy all the time. And maybe that's why this conversation matters, because some people reach old age still waiting for permission to finally live honestly, still waiting to say what they really feel, still waiting to choose themselves without guilt. And maybe healing starts there, not with some dramatic life change. Maybe it starts smaller than that. Maybe it starts the first time you admit to yourself, I'm tired of abandoning who I am just to keep everybody else comfortable. A lot of people spend most of their life trying so hard to be accepted that they don't even notice they're slowly disappearing in the process. It usually doesn't happen when they're young, not at 20, not even 30. Most of the time, it creeps in later, quietly, some random evening after work, a long drive home after another uncomfortable family dinner, a moment standing alone in the kitchen washing dishes while the rest of the house is asleep. And out of nowhere, this strange thought shows up. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. I don't even know who I am anymore. That thought scares people more than they admit, because when they look back, they realize almost everything in their life was built around one thing: being accepted, being needed, being useful, being the person nobody complains about, but not necessarily being honest, not truly honest. And honestly, most people who become chronic people pleasers never planned to end up like this. It started long before adulthood, long before relationships and jobs and marriage and responsibilities. It usually started when they were kids. Because children come into the world emotionally open. Kids cry loudly, they get angry, they laugh too hard sometimes, they want attention, they need comfort. That's normal. But somewhere along the way, a lot of children learn certain emotions make adults uncomfortable. Some parents only become warm when the child is calm and obedient. Some homes reward silence more than honesty. So the child slowly figures things out. If I stay quiet, things stay peaceful. If I don't complain, people stay happy. If I become easy to deal with, I'll be loved more. Nobody sits a child down and says, your feelings are inconvenient. It's subtler than that. A sigh, a cold reaction, being ignored after expressing emotion, getting called dramatic, too sensitive, too emotional. Small moments, but children absorb those moments deeply. Way more deeply than adults realize. A child doesn't think, my parents struggle emotionally. No, a child almost always turns inward first. They think, something about me must be wrong. So they adapt. That adaptation becomes personality later. That's the part people miss. The easy child everybody praises often grows into the adult who has no idea how to express needs without guilt. Maybe that was you. The child teachers loved because you never caused problems. The one relatives described as mature. Meanwhile, inside, you were learning how to disconnect from your own emotions before anyone else could reject them. That kind of thing follows people for decades. You can still see it in adulthood. Someone takes hours to reply to a message, and suddenly anxiety kicks in. A partner's tone changes slightly, and the nervous system immediately reacts. A small disagreement feels emotionally overwhelming, not because the person is weak, because somewhere, deep down, their brain still connects rejection with danger. That's what many people don't understand about people-pleasing. It's not just being too nice. A lot of the time, it's survival programming. Human beings are wired to seek belonging. Thousands of years ago, being rejected by the tribe could literally mean death. And emotionally, some people still carry that same ancient fear inside their body. So they become hyper-aware of everyone else's moods. They scan faces, tone of voice, energy shifts. They become experts at emotional monitoring, not because they want to, because somewhere inside their body learned, if people are unhappy with me, I'm not safe. That kind of mental exhaustion builds slowly over time, especially in relationships. Some people spend years shrinking themselves just to keep relationships peaceful. They rehearse conversations in their head before bringing something up. They soften every sentence, apologize before expressing pain, swallow anger immediately. Sometimes they stay in relationships where they no longer feel emotionally safe because being abandoned feels even scarier than being unhappy. Think about how exhausting that is, living every day carefully managing someone else's emotions while your own needs sit quietly in the background like they don't matter. And after enough years, people stop asking themselves, what do I actually feel? Instead, they ask, what keeps everybody else comfortable? That becomes automatic after a while. At work, too, especially at work. The dependable employee, the one everybody calls when something goes wrong, the person who says yes even when they're drowning. Maybe your boss praises you constantly. Maybe coworkers rely on you because they know you won't refuse. At first, it feels good. Being needed can feel strangely comforting. It gives people identity, purpose, validation. But eventually it becomes draining in a way that's hard to explain. You start waking up tired before the day even begins. Emails make your chest tight. Your phone buzzing irritates you. You fantasize about silence. Real silence. No expectations, no requests, nobody needing anything from you for a while. But then guilt appears immediately afterward. That's how deep people-pleasing goes. Even rest can feel selfish. Even boundaries feel cruel. And over time, the body starts carrying stress the mind keeps trying to ignore. The headaches, the anxiety, the inability to relax fully, that constant tight feeling in the chest. Some people think they're just aging. Sometimes they're actually emotionally exhausted from decades of suppressing themselves. That kind of exhaustion changes people. Not all at once, slowly. They become numb, detached, quietly resentful. And honestly, resentment is common among people-pleasers, not because they're bad people, because eventually the soul gets tired of being ignored. There's only so long someone can abandon themselves before anger starts leaking out somewhere. Sometimes it becomes irritation, sometimes emotional distance, sometimes sadness they can't even explain properly. And the hardest part? A lot of people-pleasers eventually become angry at themselves more than anybody else. They replay old memories thinking, why didn't I say anything? Why was I so afraid? Why did I keep allowing that? That self-blame hurts deeply, especially later in life, especially once someone realizes how much time they spent performing, pretending not to care, pretending to be okay, pretending things didn't hurt when they absolutely did. And eventually, something strange happens. People stop seeing them as human. They start seeing them as useful. That's one of the saddest truths about overgiving. The more available someone becomes, the more others begin expecting it instead of appreciating it. The responsible sibling becomes everybody's emotional caretaker. The endlessly patient partner becomes invisible. The reliable worker gets overloaded. Not because people are always cruel, sometimes because human beings naturally adapt to what's constantly available. And people-pleasers make themselves available all the time. Emotionally, mentally, physically. Until one day they look around and realize almost nobody asks what they need anymore. People ask for favors, support, time, help, but very few ask, how are you really doing? And honestly, after years of disconnecting from themselves, some people don't even know how to answer that question anymore. That's the real heartbreak, not rejection. Losing connection with yourself. Getting so used to performing that you forget what honesty even feels like. Then one day, usually later in life, grief starts appearing. Not just grief over aging, grief over the self that never got fully lived, the dreams pushed aside, the truth swallowed, the boundaries never spoken. Some people reach 60 or 70 and suddenly realize they spent most of their life trying to become acceptable instead of authentic. That realization hits hard, harder than most people expect, because deep down they know, I kept everybody comfortable except myself. And maybe part of you recognizes yourself somewhere in this conversation. Maybe that's why this feels uncomfortable. Maybe certain memories are surfacing right now, moments where you betrayed your own feelings just to avoid disappointing somebody else. Moments where you said yes while something inside you quietly broke. That awareness hurts. But honestly, it's also the beginning of something important, because people do not start healing until they finally see the pattern clearly. Not blame, not shame, just clarity. The understanding that maybe they were never too sensitive. Maybe they were simply taught that love had to be earned through sacrifice. And once somebody truly sees that, something inside begins changing, slowly but deeply, from the inside out. For a long time, a lot of people think life only changes after something big happens. A divorce, a new house, a health scare, moving somewhere far away and starting over. People imagine healing has to look dramatic before they're finally allowed to feel different inside. But honestly, that's usually not how it happens. Most real change starts in ways almost nobody notices at first. Quietly, in tiny moments that don't seem important at all when they happen. A pause before saying yes, letting the phone ring one more time before picking up, sitting in silence for a minute instead of rushing to fix everyone's mood. Small things, really small things. But for someone who has spent most of their life putting everybody else first, those moments can feel enormous, sometimes even frightening. Because people who are used to pleasing others are not used to disappointing anyone. Even a tiny boundary can feel emotionally dangerous at first, not empowering, not freeing. Honestly, more like panic. The first time someone says no after years of automatically saying yes, their body often reacts before their mind does. Their chest tightens, their stomach feels uneasy, their thoughts start racing immediately. What if they're upset? What if they think I'm selfish? What if this changes the relationship? That fear is real, especially for people who spent years believing they had to earn love by being agreeable. So when they finally begin changing, even in small ways, it feels unnatural at first, like wearing shoes that don't quite fit yet. Maybe it starts at work. A coworker asks you to stay late again. Normally, you would agree before they even finish asking. You'd smile politely, push your own plans aside, tell yourself it's not a big deal, even if you're exhausted, even if your head hurts, even if dinner is waiting at home, even if you've spent the entire week running on emotional fumes. But this time, something inside pauses. You think about yourself for once, not selfishly, just honestly. You think about the long drive home, the silence you desperately need, the way your shoulders already ache before the evening even starts. And maybe, for the first time in years, you quietly say, I can't tonight. Simple words, but for some people, those words feel almost terrifying coming out of their mouth. Then comes that uncomfortable silence, the silence people-pleasers hate. Maybe the other person looks annoyed for a second. Maybe they say, oh, all right then. And afterward, you replay the interaction over and over in your head. That part doesn't disappear immediately. People-pleasing trains people to believe someone else's disappointment automatically means they did something wrong. So even after setting one small boundary, guilt shows up fast. But later that night, something feels different too. You sit at home and realize you're tired, but not resentful. That's new. You're physically exhausted, maybe. But emotionally, there's less anger sitting inside you, less bitterness. Because deep down, your body recognizes something important happened. You chose yourself for once. And honestly, self-respect often returns that way, quietly. Not with confidence speeches, not with dramatic breakthroughs. It returns in tiny moments where a person finally stops abandoning themselves, little by little, almost the way sunlight slowly returns after a long winter. Another thing that starts changing is the constant apologizing. People who spend years trying to keep everybody comfortable apologize for everything. Sometimes so automatically they don't even hear themselves anymore. Sorry to bother you. Sorry, maybe I'm talking too much. Sorry if this sounds stupid. Meanwhile, they're apologizing for things nobody should apologize for in the first place. For needing rest, for expressing emotion, for asking for basic respect, for simply taking up space. And one day, they start noticing it, really noticing it. Somebody bumps into them and they apologize immediately. Someone interrupts them 3 times in a conversation and they still say, "Sorry, can I just say something?" That realization feels strangely sad once you become aware of it. You start realizing how often you've made yourself smaller without even thinking about it. So gradually, the language changes. Not aggressively, not coldly, just more honestly. Instead of, "Sorry to bother you," maybe they say, "When you have time, I'd like to talk." Instead of apologizing before every opinion, they simply speak. And honestly, the first few times feel awkward. Really awkward. Because people who spent years shrinking themselves are not used to speaking without cushioning every sentence first. They soften everything, over-explain everything, smile while saying things that actually hurt. So when they stop doing that, even slightly, it feels emotionally exposed. But after a while, something settles inside them. The voice becomes steadier. The nervous system relaxes a little. They stop feeling like they need permission to exist. And then there's another change that sounds tiny from the outside, but feels huge internally. Not responding immediately. Some people cannot leave a text unanswered for 20 minutes without anxiety creeping in. The phone buzzes and their whole body reacts, even if they're eating, even if they're exhausted, even if they finally sat down after a long day. Because somewhere deep down, they feel emotionally responsible for everybody's access to them. So they answer instantly, always available, always reachable, always emotionally open. Until one day, they start experimenting with space. Not ignoring people, not playing games, just space. They finish their coffee before replying. They go outside for a walk first. They sit quietly in the backyard and let themselves breathe for a few minutes. And slowly, they realize something important. Not every message is an emergency. Not every conversation deserves immediate access to their energy. That realization changes something deep inside people. Life starts feeling less emotionally chaotic, less rushed. Their mind becomes quieter. And maybe for the first time in years, silence starts feeling peaceful instead of guilty. But probably the hardest shift of all is learning to care about your own feelings without feeling selfish afterward. That part is difficult for a lot of people over 50 especially, because many were raised believing sacrifice was love. Taking care of yourself too much was selfish. Resting too much was lazy. Boundaries were rude. So they became experts at checking on everybody else while ignoring themselves completely. How are they feeling? Did I upset them? Maybe I should have handled that differently. Meanwhile, their own exhaustion sat quietly in the background for years, ignored. Until eventually, the body started protesting. The sleepless nights, the emotional burnout, that heavy feeling in the chest that never fully goes away. And slowly, very slowly, some people begin asking themselves different questions. Not, how do I keep everyone happy? But, what actually feels peaceful to me? That question changes lives. Maybe they stop attending gatherings that drain them every single time. Maybe they finally admit certain friendships only survive because they overgive constantly. Maybe they spend one evening alone without apologizing for it. At first, guilt appears immediately. Of course it does, especially for people who spent decades measuring their worth through usefulness. But underneath the guilt, another feeling starts appearing too. Relief. A deep kind of relief. The kind you feel when you finally sit down after standing all day. The kind that makes breathing easier. And eventually comes one of the hardest truths people pleasers ever have to accept. Not everybody is going to like you. That realization hurts at first, because some people spend most of their life trying to avoid disapproval completely. They overgive, over-explain, overcompensate, anything to avoid upsetting people. But life eventually teaches something unavoidable. You can be incredibly kind and still be misunderstood. You can sacrifice endlessly, and somebody will still criticize you anyway. You can spend your entire life trying to keep everybody comfortable, and it still won't guarantee acceptance. That truth feels painful, then strangely freeing, because once somebody finally accepts they cannot control how everybody feels about them, they stop exhausting themselves trying. And life becomes lighter after that. Not perfect, just lighter. Relationships become more honest. Conversations feel less forced. The body relaxes because the constant emotional performance finally starts slowing down. Even ordinary moments begin feeling different. Morning coffee tastes calmer somehow. Quiet evenings stop feeling lonely and start feeling peaceful. The silence in the house no longer feels heavy, because for the first time in a very long time, maybe decades, a person is no longer fighting themselves all day long. And honestly, healing usually doesn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It comes through tiny decisions repeated quietly over time. One honest no. One boundary spoken without apology. One evening where somebody finally chooses their own peace without feeling guilty afterward. Small things. But small things are often what slowly give people their lives back. There was a woman named Linda who spent almost her entire life believing that being needed meant being loved. Not respected, not truly understood, needed. And for a long time, she thought that was enough. If you met Linda years ago, you probably would have liked her immediately. Most people did. She had that warm energy people trust right away. The kind of woman who remembered birthdays without needing reminders. The kind who brought extra food to family dinners because she worried somebody might still be hungry. Every Thanksgiving, she woke up before sunrise while the house was still dark and quiet, standing alone in the kitchen making coffee before cooking for everyone else. Turkey in the oven, pots steaming, the sound of dishes softly clinking while the rest of the family slept upstairs. That was Linda's life, always thinking ahead for everybody else, always carrying people in her mind. Her son's financial problems, her daughter's marriage stress, her husband forgetting to take his medication again, her elderly mother's appointments. Even sitting still, her mind never really rested. There was always somebody to worry about, somebody to help, somebody needing something. And honestly, people admired her for it. At church gatherings, people would smile and say, "Linda is one of the kindest people I know," or "She never thinks about herself." And she'd laugh softly when they said those things. But deep down, those compliments didn't feel as good anymore, because somewhere along the way, her life stopped feeling like her own. That's the part nobody saw. People saw the organized house, the family photos, the casserole she brought over when someone got sick. They didn't see the nights she sat alone in the kitchen after everybody went to bed, feeling strangely empty for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Not dramatic sadness, not the kind that makes people cry loudly. It was quieter than that. a tiredness that lived in her chest all the time. Sometimes she'd stand at the sink washing dishes and stare out the window into the dark backyard, wondering why she felt so invisible, despite spending her whole life taking care of everybody. And the strange thing was, she wasn't physically alone. There were always people around. Phone calls, family visits, neighbors stopping by. But emotionally, that was different. Emotionally, Linda often felt like nobody really knew her at all. People knew what she could do. They knew she was dependable. They knew she'd show up when things fell apart. But very few people stopped and asked, "How are you really doing?" Not casually, not while distracted. Really asked. And after a while, Linda stopped asking herself, too. That's what happens to a lot of people who spend decades caring for everybody else first. Self-neglect stops feeling sad. It starts feeling normal. Her mornings belonged to other people. Her afternoons belonged to other people. Even her thoughts belonged to other people. She moved through life constantly anticipating everyone else's needs before they even spoke them out loud. And at night, when things finally became quiet, her mind still wouldn't stop. She replayed conversations, wondered if she upset someone, wondered if she should have worded something differently. Meanwhile, nobody noticed how emotionally exhausted she had become. Not even Linda fully understood it yet. She thought this was simply adulthood, responsibility, love. That was how women in her generation were taught to live. Good wives sacrifice. Good mothers endure quietly. Good women do not complain too much. So every time resentment rose inside her, guilt crushed it immediately afterward. If she wanted a day alone, she felt selfish. If she became emotionally overwhelmed, she blamed herself for being ungrateful. Even imagining a different kind of life made her uncomfortable. So she kept going, year after year. Unlike many people who spend their lives pleasing others, she became very skilled at pretending she was fine. Really skilled. She smiled while exhausted, laughed while hurt, said, "I'm okay," before anybody even asked. Until one winter morning, something inside her finally gave out. Not dramatically, no huge breakdown, no movie scene. She just woke up one morning, sat on the edge of the bed, and couldn't move. The room was quiet, cold morning light coming through the curtains, and she just sat there, staring at the floor. Not because she was lazy, not because she lacked discipline. She was simply empty, emotionally empty. The kind of exhaustion sleep can't touch. Even little things suddenly felt overwhelming. The phone ringing irritated her. Simple errands felt heavy. Noise made her anxious. And for the first time in her life, a thought surfaced that she could no longer push away. I don't think anybody really sees me. That thought broke her heart. Because suddenly she understood something painful. People loved what she gave them, her patience, her reliability, her emotional support. But almost nobody knew the woman underneath all of that. Not fully, not deeply. For weeks afterward, Linda moved differently through the world. Quieter, not angry exactly, just aware in a way she had never been before. Aware of how automatically she said yes. Aware of how uncomfortable she felt resting. Aware of how guilty she became anytime she even considered choosing herself. Then one evening, something small happened. The kind of moment most people would never think twice about. But for Linda, it changed everything. Her daughter called asking if she could babysit at the last minute. Normally, Linda would have agreed instantly, even exhausted, even drained, even if she desperately needed rest. That's what she always did. But this time, while holding the phone, she looked around the quiet house and realized how tired she truly felt. Not sleepy, soul tired. And before she could stop herself, she said softly, "I can't tonight." Silence. Immediate silence. Her daughter sounded surprised, then disappointed. Linda felt panic rise inside her almost instantly. The old programming kicked in immediately. The guilt, the fear, that terrible feeling that she had just failed somebody. For a moment, she almost changed her answer, almost said, "Never mind, I'll do it." But she didn't. After hanging up, she sat alone on the couch, shaking slightly like she had done something cruel. That's how unfamiliar boundaries were to her. For the next hour, she questioned herself nonstop. Was I selfish? Am I becoming cold? Should I call back? But later that night, something unexpected happened. She made tea, wrapped herself in a blanket, sat quietly near the living room window while snow fell outside under the streetlights. And for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Relief. Not excitement, not happiness. Relief. Quiet, unfamiliar relief. Like some exhausted part of her finally realized, nobody is asking me for anything right now. That small moment changed her slowly after that. Not overnight, real healing almost never works that way. But Linda started noticing things. Certain conversations drained her completely. Certain people only called when they needed emotional support. She realized how often she abandoned herself automatically just to keep everyone else comfortable. So she began changing little things. She stopped answering every phone call immediately, stopped volunteering automatically, paused before saying yes. At first, people reacted. Some family members accused her of changing. One friend became distant after Linda stopped being endlessly available. Even her husband seemed confused sometimes. And honestly, that hurt. But another realization slowly became impossible to ignore. Some relationships had depended entirely on her self-sacrifice. Not mutual care, not emotional balance. Sacrifice. That realization was painful, but also freeing in a strange way, because for the first time in decades, Linda started asking herself questions nobody had ever asked her before. What actually makes me peaceful? What do I enjoy? How do I want the rest of my life to feel? At first, she didn't even know the answers. That happens when someone spends most of their life disconnected from themselves. So she started small. Morning walks alone, coffee on the porch before sunrise, reading without guilt, turning her phone off for an hour. Simple things, tiny things. But those tiny moments slowly brought her back to herself, and little by little, something inside her softened. She slept better, laughed more naturally, stopped apologizing so much, stopped explaining herself constantly. Then one evening, almost a year later, Linda was sitting quietly in her living room when she realized something that nearly made her cry. For the first time in her adult life, she felt peaceful, sitting alone with herself. No performing, no caretaking, no emotional exhaustion. Just peace, real peace. And yes, a few people drifted away once she stopped sacrificing herself constantly. That part hurt, but losing herself had hurt far more. That was the truth she finally understood. And maybe that's what so many people only discover later in life. Peace doesn't come from making everybody happy. Sometimes peace begins the moment a person finally stops abandoning themselves to keep everybody else comfortable. One of the hardest things people discover after they stop trying to make everybody happy is this: some people don't stay. That realization catches a lot of people off guard, because deep down, most people imagine healing will immediately improve everything. They think, if I finally become honest, my relationships will become healthier too. And sometimes they do, but usually not right away. First comes discomfort, distance, a strange kind of loneliness nobody really warns you about. Because the moment someone stops abandoning themselves, certain relationships start shifting almost immediately. You can feel it. The energy changes fast. Especially if you spent most of your life being the easy person, the agreeable one, the understanding one, the person who never caused tension, the one everybody relied on because you were always available, always answering, always helping, always adjusting yourself to make everybody else comfortable. Then one day, after years of living like that, something inside finally gets tired. Not angry exactly, just tired. Tired of saying yes when your whole body wants to say no. Tired of over-explaining yourself. Tired of feeling emotionally responsible for everybody around you. So little changes begin happening. You stop replying instantly. You stop apologizing for every little thing. You start protecting your energy in ways that feel unfamiliar, even to yourself. You begin saying simple things like, "I can't today. I need some rest. That doesn't work for me." Honestly, those sentences sound so small, but for lifelong people pleasers, those words can feel enormous, almost dangerous. And the surprising part is how strongly some people react to them. Not because boundaries are cruel, but because certain people got very comfortable with the version of you that didn't have any. That realization hurts more than most people expect, because it forces someone to ask a painful question. Did they actually love me, or did they love how easy I was to control? That question sits heavy in the chest, especially later in life. Especially for people who spent decades believing sacrifice was proof of love. You see this happen in families all the time. A woman spends 30 years always saying yes, watching the grandkids whenever somebody calls, hosting every holiday, solving every family problem. Then eventually she starts getting tired. Not regular tired, deep tired. The kind where even hearing the phone ring makes her shoulders tense up. So one day she says, "I can't this weekend." And suddenly somebody gets offended. Somebody calls her selfish. Somebody says, "You've changed." But what really changed? Not her love, not her heart. She simply stopped ignoring herself. That's all. And strangely, for some people, even that feels threatening. The same thing happens at work. The dependable employee who always stayed late suddenly starts protecting their time. Now coworkers act irritated. Managers become colder. Why? Because people naturally adjust to whatever version of you repeatedly give them. If you spend years teaching people that your needs come last, eventually they stop even noticing you have needs at all. Not always because they're cruel, sometimes because human beings adapt quickly to emotional patterns. And people pleasers create patterns where they are endlessly available. So when availability suddenly disappears, people notice immediately. The old version of you made life easier for them. The old version absorbed discomfort quietly, stayed patient quietly, handled emotional pressure quietly. And once that version begins disappearing, reactions start showing up. Sometimes subtly, shorter conversations, less warmth, fewer invitations. Sometimes directly. "You're too sensitive now. You used to be easier to talk to. You care too much about yourself lately." Those comments hurt deeply in the beginning, especially because people pleasers already struggle with guilt. So after setting one boundary, they often spend the entire night questioning themselves. Am I wrong? Am I becoming selfish? Why does this feel so uncomfortable? That part is real. Nobody talks enough about how emotionally confusing growth can feel at first, because before freedom feels peaceful, it often feels lonely, very lonely. There's this strange in-between stage people go through. The old version of them no longer fits anymore, but the new version still feels unfamiliar. That stage can feel emotionally empty. You start noticing which conversations drain you. You stop forcing yourself to attend gatherings that leave you exhausted for days afterward. You spend more evenings alone. And honestly, at first, the silence can feel uncomfortable. Too quiet. Almost unsettling, because some people spent their entire life staying busy for everybody else, fixing things, helping people, managing emotions. Not because they loved chaos, because constant caretaking distracted them from themselves. Now suddenly there's space, and space forces honesty. Some nights become emotional. A person sits alone in the living room, staring at the television without really watching it, wondering, did I ruin my relationships? Did I push people away? But slowly something important begins changing underneath all that loneliness. The loneliness starts feeling different. Before, they were surrounded by people, but disconnected from themselves. Now, even though life feels quieter, they're finally becoming honest. And honesty changes a person in ways that are hard to explain until you experience it yourself. The body changes, seriously. People start sleeping deeper, breathing slower, feeling calmer in ordinary moments. The nervous system slowly stops living in survival mode all the time. That constant fear of disappointing everybody starts loosening its grip, little by little. And after a while, people begin noticing something surprising. They actually feel lighter. Not happier every second, not magically healed, just lighter, less emotionally crowded inside. Their voice changes too. They stop over-explaining every decision, stop apologizing before speaking, stop rehearsing conversations in their head all night long. And what slowly grows underneath all of that is something many people-pleasers never truly had before: self-respect. Quiet self-respect, not arrogance, not ego, just the realization that their needs matter too. That realization changes people deeply, even physically sometimes. Their face softens, their eyes look calmer, their laughter sounds more real. Because pretending all day drains enormous energy. Monitoring everybody's emotions drains enormous energy. Performing kindness while secretly exhausted drains enormous energy. And once somebody stops performing constantly, the body finally relaxes. Then something unexpected begins happening. Different relationships start appearing, healthier ones. Not perfect people, not fantasy relationships, just people who allow honesty to exist. People who don't punish boundaries. People who respect space. People who don't require constant emotional performance in order to stay connected. And honestly, that kind of connection feels unfamiliar at first, sometimes even suspicious. Because lifelong people-pleasers are so used to relationships built around overgiving that calm relationships almost feel strange. They keep waiting for criticism, waiting for disappointment, waiting for someone to suddenly become angry. But gradually, they realize something beautiful. Real love doesn't require constant self-sacrifice. Real connection doesn't demand exhaustion. And maybe the most emotional part of this whole transformation is finally discovering who you actually are underneath all the performance. That discovery often comes late, after 50, after 60, sometimes even later than that. A person suddenly realizes they have opinions they buried years ago, dreams they ignored, feelings they never allowed themselves to express honestly. And yes, grief comes with that realization too. Real grief. Grief for the years spent pretending. Grief for the version of themselves that never fully got to live honestly. That part hurts. But eventually, another feeling appears too. Freedom. Quiet freedom. The freedom of resting without guilt. The freedom of saying, no, I disagree. I need space. That hurt me. Simple things, yet for some people, those simple words change their entire life. And yes, freedom costs something. Sometimes relationships end. Sometimes people misunderstand you. Sometimes certain people leave once you stop overgiving constantly. That pain is real. But honestly, there's something even more painful than losing people. Losing yourself. Waking up old one day realizing you've spent your entire life performing for acceptance instead of actually living honestly. That pain stays much longer. Because freedom always costs something, but abandoning yourself costs far more. There comes a point in life when the exhaustion stops feeling emotional and starts feeling spiritual. A deeper kind of tired. Not the kind fixed by sleeping in on a weekend. Not the kind cured by a short vacation or a few quiet days at home. This kind sits somewhere deeper. A person wakes up one morning and realizes they've spent years trying to receive peace from people who could never truly give it to them. And that realization changes something inside, quietly at first, because a lot of people were raised believing that being good meant keeping everybody happy, keeping the family together, avoiding conflict, making sure nobody feels uncomfortable. especially in older generations. A lot of people listening right now probably grew up hearing things like, "Don't upset people, be grateful, keep the peace." So they learned very early to become emotionally careful, helpful, available, easy to deal with. They became the spouse who always understood, the parent who carried everybody's problems, the friend who listened for hours, the son or daughter who never wanted to disappoint the family. And for years, maybe decades, they carried all of that quietly, without realizing how heavy it was becoming. That's the strange thing about people-pleasing. At first, it looks like love. It even feels like love sometimes. But underneath it, there's often fear hiding quietly in the background. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear that if they stop giving so much, they may stop being loved altogether. That kind of fear changes people slowly. It changes how they speak, how they make decisions, how they move through relationships. Some people stay silent their whole life because they're terrified of conflict. Some stay in exhausting relationships because loneliness scares them more than unhappiness. Some spend decades pretending to be okay because they don't want to become a burden to anybody else. And after enough years, the soul becomes tired, really tired. Not dramatic, not loud, just worn down from constantly performing. That's why so many people eventually reach a moment later in life where they stop asking, "How do I make everyone happy?" and start asking something much deeper. Why am I so afraid to disappoint people? That question changes everything. Because once a person starts looking honestly at that fear, they begin realizing how much of their life has been controlled by it. And spiritually, that matters more than most people think. Fear quietly controls people's entire lives without them noticing. It decides who they become, what they tolerate, what truth they suppress. And little by little, people drift away from themselves trying to avoid rejection. But Scripture says something very different about how human beings were meant to live. In 2 Timothy 1:7 it says, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind." Think about that for a moment. A sound mind, peace, calmness, not constant anxiety over everybody else's opinions. Yet so many people live as if their emotional safety depends entirely on keeping everyone pleased with them. They monitor every reaction, every facial expression, every slight change in tone. Someone replies differently to a text message, and their chest tightens immediately. Someone sounds disappointed, and suddenly guilt takes over the whole day. That's exhausting, not just mentally, spiritually exhausting. Because the soul was never meant to survive inside constant fear of rejection. And maybe that's why some people eventually feel emotionally disconnected from themselves later in life. They spent so many years performing kindness while suppressing honesty that eventually they stopped knowing where the performance ended and the real self began. Years saying yes while internally feeling no. Years smiling while carrying resentment they didn't feel allowed to express. Years pretending to feel peaceful while quietly feeling emotionally trapped. Eventually, something inside gets tired of living divided like that. Human beings were not designed to constantly betray themselves. And honestly, one of the most healing things a person can realize is this: love does not require destroying yourself. That sentence alone changes people deeply. Because some generations especially were taught that exhaustion equals devotion, that sacrificing yourself endlessly makes you loving. A lot of women grew up believing good mothers always put themselves last, good wives endure quietly, good people never complain too much. So they gave everything they had emotionally until they barely recognized themselves anymore. Meanwhile, something interesting happens when you really look at the life of Jesus. He rested. That matters. He stepped away from crowds regularly. He disappeared into quiet places to pray. He did not spend every hour trying to satisfy everybody around him. Even Jesus disappointed people sometimes. That surprises many people when they really think about it, because a lot of us were taught holiness means constant availability. But Jesus often chose truth over approval. He allowed people to misunderstand him, allowed people to walk away from him. Why? Because living truthfully mattered more than performing for acceptance. That changes the way a person sees their own life, especially later in life, because eventually many people realize they were not truly loving others well. They were managing fear. There's a difference. Real love feels grounded, calm, honest. Fear-based people-pleasing feels anxious all the time. It constantly asks, are they upset with me? Do they still approve of me? Did I disappoint somebody? That's not peace. That's emotional survival mode. And God never intended people to live emotionally enslaved to everybody else's reactions. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Not performance, truth. That's what frees people. The moment they stop pretending, stop shrinking themselves, stop apologizing for existing, stop sacrificing their mental and emotional health just to avoid making other people uncomfortable. Of course, truth changes relationships, sometimes painfully. Not everybody welcomes honesty. Not everybody likes boundaries. Some people preferred the exhausted version of you because that version never challenged anything, never said no, never needed space, never disrupted the emotional balance. So when a person finally becomes honest later in life, some relationships become uncomfortable. That part hurts. It really does. But spiritual healing often starts exactly there, not with comfort, with truth. And maybe that's why some people become emotional the first time they finally set boundaries. Not because they became selfish, because some hidden part of them finally feels safe enough to stop performing, safe enough to rest, safe enough to breathe, safe enough to be real. There's something deeply spiritual about finally allowing yourself to exist honestly. Not perfectly, not endlessly agreeable, just honestly. For many people, healing begins quietly after that. Early mornings sitting alone with coffee before the rest of the house wakes up. Soft sunlight coming through the kitchen window. Reading scripture slowly without rushing through it. Turning off the television for a while. Letting silence exist again. And during those small, quiet moments, something inside starts softening. The nervous system calms down. The pressure inside the chest eases a little. A person slowly begins realizing, my worth does not come from how useful I am to everyone else. That realization changes people deeply, because many spent most of their life believing they had to earn love through service, through sacrifice, through emotional labor, through constantly proving their value. But God does not measure people the way human beings do. People measure usefulness. God sees the heart. That difference matters more with age, because eventually the soul stops wanting applause. It stops wanting approval all the time. It just wants peace, real peace, the kind that comes when somebody finally understands, I can care about people without abandoning myself. That realization heals something very deep. And honestly, many people cry quietly the first time they fully understand it, because suddenly they see how many years they lived carrying unnecessary guilt, how many times they betrayed their own spirit trying to maintain approval. That grief is real. But so is the freedom afterward, because once somebody begins living honestly, life changes internally. They breathe differently, pray differently, rest differently. The mind becomes quieter. Not perfect, not problem-free, just quieter. And maybe that's one of the deepest forms of healing a person can experience later in life. Not becoming more impressive, not becoming more admired, just becoming honest. Honest with people, honest with themselves, honest before God. And strangely enough, that honesty brings more peace than years of emotional performance ever did. Because when people reach the end of life, most don't regret disappointing others once in a while. They regret losing themselves trying too hard not to. And maybe that's why real peace finally begins the moment somebody understands one simple truth. God never asked you to disappear in order to deserve love. Maybe one of the strangest things about healing is realizing how long you've been living disconnected from yourself without fully noticing it. Not because you were weak, not because there was something wrong with you. Life just slowly trained you to believe that being loved meant being easy to live with, easy to manage, easy to rely on, easy to keep around. So little by little, you adapted. You became quieter in certain conversations. You learned how to read people's moods before speaking. You learned how to apologize quickly, even when you weren't really sure what you did wrong. You learned how to say things like, "It's fine. Don't worry about me. Whatever everybody else wants is okay." And after enough years, that version of you stopped feeling temporary. It just became who you were, or at least who everybody thought you were. And maybe for a long time, that worked. People appreciated you, called you thoughtful, dependable, selfless. Maybe people even admired how patient you were. But underneath all of that, something inside you kept getting more tired. Quietly tired. The kind of tired nobody notices because you still show up, still smile, still answer the phone, still ask everybody else how they're doing. Meanwhile, inside there's this growing heaviness you can't fully explain. Because a person can spend an entire lifetime being appreciated for what they give and still feel emotionally unseen. That's the painful part. A lot of people carry that feeling for years without ever saying it out loud. They become the caretaker in the family, the one everybody leans on, the dependable friend, the calm one during emergencies. Everybody depends on them emotionally, but almost nobody asks what carrying all that has done to them. And after a while, they stop asking themselves, too. That's usually when the exhaustion gets deeper with age, because eventually the soul gets tired of performing all the time. Tired of shrinking itself. Tired of pretending certain things don't hurt. Tired of holding relationships together through pure emotional effort. At some point, approval stops being enough. People start craving something else entirely. Peace. Not compliments, not praise, not hearing, "You're such a good person." Real peace. The kind where your nervous system finally relaxes for once. The kind where you don't spend the entire day monitoring everybody else's emotions. And honestly, for a lot of people, that change doesn't begin dramatically. It starts small. Really small. One honest no. One evening where they stop answering calls for a while because they're emotionally exhausted. One moment where they finally admit, "I don't actually want to do this." Small moments like that change people more than they realize, because every time somebody stops abandoning themselves, even in tiny ways, something inside starts returning. Slowly, almost carefully. Maybe that's what this whole journey is really about. Not becoming cold, not becoming selfish, just becoming honest after years of hiding. There's a difference, a big difference. Some people hear conversations like this and immediately panic a little. They think, "So what now? Am I supposed to stop caring about people?" No, that's not what this means. Caring about people is beautiful. Loving people matters. But there's a difference between loving people and disappearing inside relationships. And honestly, a lot of people were never taught that difference, especially older generations. Many people grew up believing sacrifice was the purest form of love, so they kept giving, kept tolerating, kept overextending themselves emotionally, even when they were exhausted, even when resentment quietly started building underneath. They carried everybody else emotionally while slowly losing connection with themselves. And eventually, life forces a person to notice, sometimes through burnout, sometimes through loneliness, sometimes through sitting alone late at night realizing, "I don't think I can keep living like this anymore." Maybe you know that feeling personally. Maybe there were nights you sat quietly in the dark after everybody went to sleep, feeling emotionally drained in a way you couldn't explain. Not dramatic sadness, just emptiness, like your spirit was tired. You smiled through dinners, through family gatherings, through conversations where everybody talked about themselves while nobody really noticed how exhausted you looked. And still, you kept going. That's what so many people do. They keep functioning while quietly falling apart inside. And maybe that's why this kind of message hits people emotionally, because somewhere deep down, they recognize themselves in it. Especially people who spent decades trying to become acceptable to everyone around them. But eventually a person reaches a moment where they have to ask themselves something uncomfortable. What about me? Not in a selfish way, in an honest way. What about my peace? What about my exhaustion? What about the life I've spent neglecting emotionally? That question changes people. Because healing often begins the moment someone finally understands they are not selfish for having limits, not selfish for needing rest, not selfish for wanting honesty, not selfish for protecting their emotional energy. They're human, that's all. And human beings were never designed to survive by constantly abandoning themselves. Eventually, the body reacts. Eventually, the mind gets overwhelmed. Eventually, the soul gets tired of carrying a life that feels emotionally fake. And honestly, one of the most painful realizations people have later in life is this. The version of themselves that kept everybody comfortable was also the version slowly destroying them. That realization hurts deeply, because suddenly they see how many years they spent ignoring themselves. How many times they said yes while something inside them quietly said no. How many relationships survived only because they kept sacrificing themselves to maintain them. That grief is real. But strangely, freedom starts there too. Real freedom, not loud freedom, quiet freedom. The freedom of finally saying, no, I can't. I need space. That hurt me. I'm tired. Simple sentences, but for some people, those words feel almost revolutionary after a lifetime of silence. Because every honest sentence gives them a small piece of themselves back, and over time, those pieces slowly reconnect, a little at a time, until one day, something feels different. They breathe differently, sleep differently. The constant pressure inside their chest starts softening. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because they finally stopped fighting themselves every day. And honestly, maybe that's the real transformation. Not becoming a completely different person. Just returning to the person you were before fear taught you to perform for acceptance. Before guilt convinced you your needs didn't matter. Before exhaustion became your normal state. You were never born to spend your whole life emotionally shrinking yourself so other people could stay comfortable. You were never meant to become a performance. You were never meant to carry everybody emotionally while secretly disappearing yourself. You were meant to live honestly, to love honestly, to exist honestly. And maybe hearing that feels emotional because part of you already knew it. Maybe that's why this conversation stayed with you. Because deep down, there's still a part of you that wants peace more than approval now. A part that's tired of apologizing for existing. A part that's tired of carrying everybody all the time. And honestly, maybe that part deserves your attention now more than ever. Because life moves quickly, faster than people think. Years pass quietly. Children grow older. Bodies slow down. People change. And eventually, many people realize something they wish they understood much earlier. Peace matters more than performance. At the end of life, most people do not regret disappointing others occasionally, but many regret abandoning themselves for too long. They regret the years spent pretending, the years spent exhausted, the years spent trying so hard to become acceptable to everybody. So maybe this is where something begins changing for you too. Not dramatically, not overnight, just quietly. Maybe tonight is simply the first night you stop apologizing for needing peace. Maybe tonight is the first night you admit how tired you really are. Maybe tonight is the beginning of returning to yourself again, slowly, honestly, without shame. And if something in this message felt personal to you, leave a period in the comments. Just a period, nothing else. Sometimes people don't need long explanations to recognize each other's pain. And maybe somebody else reading those comments tonight will realize they're not alone either. Share this video with the person who gives too much of themselves, the one everybody depends on, the one who never complains, the one quietly carrying exhaustion nobody sees. And if you want more conversations like this, more healing, more honesty, more reminders that your peace matters too, subscribe to the channel and stay with us on this journey. Because maybe, for the first time in your life, you no longer need anybody's permission to finally be yourself.